In this video, we're going to talk about the principles of art. The principles of art are what we use to organize the elements of art. Whereas the elements of art are the pieces and the things, the principles are the ways that we put those together. So these are more concepts as opposed to actual things that you can represent on a piece of paper. Our first one is balance. Now you'll notice on the note sheet you have spaces for two different types. So this slide will give you the definition for balance in general. When you think of balance, you should think of a scale. We're not dealing with physical weight, obviously. In art, we're dealing with visual weight. So we're talking about the use of space, how much space is used on either side, and is it balanced out by the space being used, the power of the colors. If you split this down the middle visually, just pretend to put a line down the middle, you'll see that the amount of white space, the background space, is pretty much equal on either side. Going a step further, we can also split it down the middle and look at the distribution of colors. If you split it down the middle and look at red, there's about the same amount of red on either side. Yellow, black. The only one that isn't is blue, but that is balanced out by other darker values. And that does have a purpose, which we'll talk about later on. So balance is the way the elements are arranged to create a feeling of stability in a work. And most importantly, there's equal visual weight on each side. So our first type of balance is symmetrical balance. If you recognize the word for math, you'll remember that symmetrical means that there is mirror image on either side. So the use of space is the same on either side. It doesn't mean that it's the exact same things on either side. It's the use of space. So if we were to split this down the middle, the obvious things are the room. That's very symmetrical, the same amount of doors, the same amount of windows on either side. The table is centered. The people are what sometimes gets students caught up. If you split it down the middle, we have the central figure there, Jesus, and he actually is symmetrical. But then the people on either side, students will say, oh, well, it's not the same person, and this person's a little taller, this is a woman, this is a man, or whatever. But we're talking about the positive space, the use of space. The use of space is the same on either side. So this is symmetrical. Symmetrical balance is the parts of an image are arranged so that one side mirrors the other. There's equal visual weight that is arranged the same on either side. Next to your note, you'll see a box. For each one, I'll have a little diagram for you. These are just the most basic representations of these principles. So draw this diagram in the box. These are some examples of symmetrical balance. So if you put an imaginary line down the middle, you'll see that the use of space is the same on either side. Our second type of balance is asymmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance, being that it's balanced, the use of space is the same on either side, but it is not arranged in a mirror image. So if we were to put an imaginary line down the middle of this, it would go through the white picture and through the woman's knees. Her dress, that big dark spot, is more towards the bottom right. That's balanced out by the big dark curtain on the top left. If you split it down the middle and look at the distribution of white, the picture frame on the wall is on the left side, and that's a large white area. And then there's a little bit of white on the curtains. And those are balanced out by the woman's hands, her bonnet, the frame behind her head, the amount of gray for the wall, the floor, all of those things are balanced out. So asymmetrical balance is when one side of an image does not reflect the design of the other. Equal visual weight that is arranged differently on either side. And here's your diagram. The three small rectangles total the area of the larger square. Our second principle of art is emphasis. Emphasis is when one thing or area stands out. The picture on the left is obvious what stands out, the heart. That has emphasis because it is a different shape, a different size, a different color, and a different value really, and its placement is right in the middle. So that is one obvious thing that stands out. The painting on the right, the woman's head has emphasis because that is dark and the rest of the image is light. So emphasis is the focal point of an image, or when one area or thing stands out the most. Our diagram there has a large circle among a bunch of smaller, lighter circles. And that is the one obvious focal point that has emphasis. Our third principle of art is contrast. Contrast and emphasis sometimes get confused by students. Contrast is having opposites. Black versus white, light versus dark, opposite colors, opposite textures. The photo by Ansel Adams shows contrast because we have the dark black of the tree against the white bright of the sky. The painting on the right by Salvador Dali shows contrast for a few reasons, the most obvious being the colors. We have orange on the right and blue in the sky, and those are the main colors in the image. And if you know anything about the color wheel, those are opposites. Those are complementary, contrasting colors. We also talk about this one with contrast for other reasons. The sky is soft. The rocks are sharp and hard, so you can bring contrast in for texture and things like that. You can use contrast kind of conceptually too. The sky looks more moist and like it's going to rain, but the orange looks more like dry and in a desert. So contrast is a large difference between two things in an image, and the key word there is opposites. And then our diagram shows a black rectangle on a white area and a white rectangle on a black area. Continuing with contrast, these are just a few images that are really great examples of contrast, having different colors or values next to each other. Our next principle of art, and these two actually we'll put together, are rhythm and movement. If you think about rhythm, you probably think about music. And rhythm is a regular repetition, something that makes you follow. Rhythm, boom, 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 boom. Rhythm in art is using the elements of art to create that repetition, that regular pattern that makes you follow. This painting by Marcel Duchamp has repeating shapes that make your eye bounce from the top left to the bottom right. It has lines that repeat and circle-like shapes that repeat. And that creates rhythm. So rhythm creates movement. Rhythm makes your eye move through an image. So rhythm is a regular repetition of elements to produce the look and feel of movement. Now, at this point, I ask, does this show rhythm? And at this point, you should say, no, it doesn't. And then I would ask you why. And you would say, because it doesn't show repetition. There's no element that's repeating. Yes, it shows a man in what you know as a state of movement, but it does not show the principle of art of movement. These are some great examples, just doing a Google search, movement in photography, rhythm in photography, And if you look at each one of these, they have repetition, but not just repetition, it follows a path. It makes your eye follow a path and move through the image, bouncing from object to object. And here's an example of a painting with rhythm. He used the swirls, the shapes, the brush strokes in particular to create rhythm and movement and really make this look like it has energy and it is moving. Our next principle of art is pattern and repetition. Put those on the same line. This should be a pretty obvious one, and it does relate to rhythm and movement. You can think about pattern as a more regular repetition. Fabric, wallpaper, printed paper, like on the left there, where it's the exact same thing over and over again. And yes, this can have movement. It can overlap, but it doesn't always. The painting on the right is by Gustav Klimt, or a part of a Gustav Klimt painting. He was known for using pattern and repetition in his artwork, on the clothing, for his backgrounds, in the plants and nature that he put in there. So he has the pattern and repetition of the rectangles and the circles and the flowers. So pattern and repetition is just repetition of a design, and you can draw whatever pattern you want there as long as it's just the exact same thing or the exact same things repeating over and over and over in a very regular way. Our next principle of art is variety. Variety is having lots of change and differences. Now, I don't want you to confuse this with just throwing a bunch of things on a canvas and calling it a day. Variety is still balanced. It's still thought out, but it's having a lot of change, which makes the artwork a little bit more interesting. So this one has a variety of colors. It has a variety of shapes, a variety of different thicknesses of lines and values. And if you split this down the middle, it still is balanced. The use of space is still planned out, but variety is just within that balance, using a lot of different things as opposed to limiting what you're using. So variety is the use of differences and change to increase the visual interest of the work. And in my diagram, I have circles, squares, triangles. They all vary in size, and then they even vary in value and texture. So just draw a variety of shapes, but make sure that you're balancing out the composition. Our next one is proportion. Proportion is size. It deals with the relative size. So you might say this man is in proportion to this building. So that's basically saying the man is the right size compared to the building. So this painting is a great example of proportion because everything looks right. The people are in proportion to each other so that they look further away. They're in proportion to the building so they look like they're actually in the setting. So proportion is the size of things compared to other things in an image. And then your key word there is comparative size. And for my diagram, I just drew a little landscape. I have a tree that's large in the front, and then 3 trees that are smaller because they're in the back. They're in proportion to the tree in the front. Now, with proportion, it doesn't always have to be accurate. You can purposely play with proportion, like a lot of the surrealist artists did. This is a great example of inaccurate proportions, but the artist did it on purpose. So the objects are not in proportion to the room that they're in, but they are in proportion to each other. And that is to give you kind of this confusing feel to make it strange. So they use proportion as a tool to create a different kind of artwork. Last but not least, we have unity. Now this is kind of our overall principle. A unified artwork kind of has everything working together. A simpler way to think about it is creating one similarity between all of the pieces of an artwork. So the two on the right, the red sculpture and the black sculpture, the artist created unity by taking all of those separate individual pieces. On the top, they're all different pieces of metal. They might have been had different finishes. The one on the bottom is pieces of wood, pieces of metal, plastic. But the artist created unity within that piece with all those separate little things by making them all the same color. So all of those different materials and all those different things have one element in common, which ties them together. The one on the left shows unity for actually the same reason. The artist limited the colors that he used. He only used reds, blues, and yellows. So if you look and kind of pick out blues, you see them scattered throughout the artwork, in the window, in her dress, in the tablecloth, in the bar of the tapestry hanging on the wall, in her veil, the white veil, the yellows in the tablecloth, in the tapestry, in the window, in her skin, in her dress, in the wall. The red is in her skin, a little bit in the window, in the details on the tapestry. So the artist purposely used those same colors throughout to have things look visually similar. So unity is when there is an element or elements that makes everything in an image relate. It creates a similarity between things. And a more general explanation is when all the elements and principles work together to create a pleasing work.